I was still lighting the candles on my 30th birthday cake when my phone lit up with a photo of my entire family smiling around my mother's dining table. Glasses raised, my brother's wife leaning into the frame like she had won something, and the caption read, "Family only." My mother had used my silverware. My father was carving the roast I had helped pay for. And the empty seat at their table, the one that should have been mine, had been filled with a flower arrangement like I had already been erased. Before I tell you how that night cracked my family right down the middle, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment only if this story truly resonates with you. And tell me the city or country you're watching from, and your local time right now. My name is Claire Bennett, I'm 30 years old. And this was the birthday that taught me how quickly love can turn into exclusion. To understand how I ended up staring at that photo with my cake going cold in front of me, I need to take you back to where the shift really began. I had spent the whole afternoon convincing myself that turning 30 would feel like a reset. I left work early, stopped by a bakery in Brookfield to pick up the vanilla cake I'd ordered 3 days before, and drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let in that cool March air that still smells a little like winter. I cleaned my apartment twice even though no one in my family had ever once complimented my place. I set the table for 6. I folded cloth napkins the way my mother taught me when I was 10. I put out the good plates, the ones with the thin gold rim, and I arranged fresh tulips in a glass vase because my younger sister Molly always said tulips made a room feel expensive. I even made my dad's favorite garlic mashed potatoes from scratch, and a lemon butter salmon I knew my mother would pretend to criticize before taking seconds. I kept checking the time, not nervously at first, just casually, the way you do when you trust people to show up. At 6:10 I told myself traffic was probably bad. At 6:22 I reheated the rolls. At 6:37 I texted our family group chat, "Hey, just making sure everyone's still coming." No one answered. That part stung, but not enough to scare me yet. Families get distracted. Phones die. People run late. That's what I told myself while I fixed the angle of the cake stand for the 3rd time and smoothed the front of the navy dress I had bought for this dinner because 30 had felt like a number that deserved a little effort. By 7:05, the salmon had dried out at the edges. The butter sauce had gone cloudy. The candles I'd set beside the cake were starting to bend slightly near the bottom from the heat of the kitchen. I called my mother first. Straight to voicemail. Then my father. No answer. Then Ethan, my older brother. Ringing, then silence. I stood there with my phone in my hand and that weird tight feeling in my chest that comes right before your mind stops protecting you from the obvious. Then Instagram did what my family would not. Molly had posted a story. I almost didn't open it because I figured it would be some blurry video of her dog or a coffee shop. Instead it was my parents' dining room, bright and full and loud. My brother Ethan was there. His wife Vanessa was there in a cream sweater, smiling with that soft innocent face she wore whenever she wanted to look harmless. My mother was at the head of the table. My father was laughing. There was roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, my mother's green bean casserole, and the blue and white serving bowl that only came out for birthdays and holidays. For one full second I actually thought maybe this was some surprise for me, and they were about to walk through my door any minute. Then Molly panned across the table, and I saw the little chalkboard sign propped near the centerpiece. Family only. I cannot explain the feeling of seeing your own family define itself in a way that excludes you, except to say it does something cold to your bones. It was not forgetfulness. It was not miscommunication. It was a decision. And the worst part was how familiar it suddenly felt. Because standing alone in my apartment in my dress, with my untouched birthday cake and 6 place settings waiting for people who had chosen another table over mine, I realized that night had not come out of nowhere. It was only the first time they had been careless enough to let me see it clearly. For a long time after I saw that post I did not move. I just stood there in my apartment with my phone in one hand and a cake server in the other, like my body had not yet caught up to what my family had done. The candles were still unlit, the frosting was beginning to soften at the edges, and somewhere in the kitchen the oven timer I had forgotten to turn off kept beeping every 30 seconds, sharp and stupid and totally indifferent to the fact that something inside me had just shifted. I wish I could tell you I cried right away because crying would have at least given the hurt somewhere to go. But I did not. I set my phone face down on the counter, turned off the oven timer, and walked back to the table I had spent all afternoon preparing. 6 plates. 6 folded napkins. 6 water glasses. I started clearing them one by one carefully, Because the only thing more humiliating than being excluded was knowing I had made the table look beautiful for people who had already decided not to come. I put the salmon into glass containers I knew I would not touch for days. I scraped the mashed potatoes into a bowl and covered them with foil. I carried the rolls back to the kitchen and dropped them into the trash harder than I meant to. Then I came back for the cake. It was still perfect, pale vanilla frosting, little white sugar flowers around the edge, Happy 30th Claire written in soft gold piping. I looked at it for a second and then slid the whole thing into the refrigerator without cutting a slice. That was the part that finally broke something open in me. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet realization that I had spent 30 years making room for people who would never think twice before taking mine away. At 7:42 my phone buzzed. For one awful second I thought maybe it was my mother saying there had been some mistake. Instead it was a text from her that said, "We thought it was better to keep tonight low stress." I read it 3 times because I genuinely could not understand how a mother writes something like that to her daughter on her birthday and still thinks she is the reasonable one. Low stress for whom? Better for whom? There was no apology in it, no explanation, not even the decency to sound ashamed. Just that polished, careful language my mother used whenever she wanted to make something cruel sound practical. A few minutes later, Molly sent a separate message with a heart emoji and, "I figured you would not want the tension." That one actually made me laugh, but it was the kind of laugh that comes out when you are too stunned to react normally. They had not just excluded me. They had built a version of events where I was the problem they were managing. That was the first time I understood that whatever was happening in my family had already been discussed without me. I sat down at the kitchen counter and started scrolling backward through months of little things I had talked myself out of noticing. The Thanksgiving side chat where everyone made plans and forgot to include me until the day before. The Sunday brunch Molly casually mentioned after it had already happened. The week my father had a follow-up appointment and I only found out because Ethan posted a photo from the parking garage saying family comes first. Even Christmas had felt off. Vanessa had handed me a candle set from a drugstore while Ethan got a watch from my parents and Molly got plane tickets for spring break in Charleston. I had smiled and thanked everyone. And later in the car I had told myself I was too old to care about gifts. But it was never about the gifts. It was about the pattern. Vanessa arriving in the family 5 years earlier had changed the temperature of every room without ever once raising her voice. She was subtle. That was what made her dangerous. She never said, "Do not invite Claire." She said things like, "Claire seems overwhelmed lately, maybe she needs space." She never openly criticized me. She sighed and said, "I just never know how she is going to take things." And because she always sounded concerned instead of mean, everyone let her shape the story. By 8:30 that night, my apartment was clean again, like dinner had never been planned at all. The only evidence left was the smell of lemon butter still hanging in the air and the unopened cake in my refrigerator. I changed out of my dress, washed my face, and sat on the edge of my bed in an old college t-shirt, staring at the wall, trying to decide whether what hurt more was the exclusion itself or the fact that some part of me had been preparing for it. That was when my phone lit up again with Ethan's name. And the second I saw it, I knew whatever came next was not going to be an apology. Ethan did not start with happy birthday. He did not even start with something that sounded human. The first thing he said was, "I do not know why you are making this into such a huge thing." And I remember pulling the phone away from my ear for a second just to look at his name on the screen and make sure I had not accidentally answered a call from a stranger. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with my knees tucked up, my makeup half washed off, the lamp on my nightstand throwing that soft yellow light that makes everything feel quieter than it is, and his voice came through sharp and impatient, like I was the one who had inconvenienced him. I said, "You all had dinner without me on my birthday, Ethan." There was a pause, not the kind that comes from guilt, but the kind that comes from someone deciding how much truth they are willing to offer. Then he said, "It was not supposed to be a whole production. Mom thought it would be easier if things stayed calm tonight." Calm. There was that word again, passed around my family like a legal defense. Calm meant no uncomfortable questions. Calm meant do not upset Vanessa. Calm meant Claire can absorb the hit and everybody else can still eat dessert. I asked him what exactly was supposed to stay calm, and he let out a breath like I was exhausting him. He said I had been distant lately, that people felt like I was always reading into things, that Vanessa especially felt uncomfortable around me because I had a way of making every family gathering tense. It was so polished, so rehearsed, that I knew immediately these were not his words. Ethan was never this articulate when he was angry. He got blunt. He got loud. This was cleaner than that. This sounded like something said across a kitchen island in a low voice while pouring wine. I asked him one question then. I said, "Did you all decide together not to come, or did you just decide not to tell me?" He did not answer directly. Instead he said, "You know what, this is exactly why nobody wanted drama tonight." And there it was, the little twist that always happens in families like mine, where the person who is hurt becomes the person who is difficult simply because she noticed. I should tell you something important about Ethan. Growing up, he was the kind of older brother who assumed the world would soften for him. If he forgot something, someone else would remember. If he messed up, someone else would smooth it over. If he needed money, time, favors, cover, advice, there was always someone in the family ready to give it. And more often than not that someone was me. When he struggled in college, I edited his resumes. When he got behind on rent at 26, I sent him $800 and told him not to worry about paying me back until he could breathe again. When he and Vanessa were planning their wedding and suddenly everything was running over budget, I spent 2 weekends helping with vendor calls and invitation issues because Mom was overwhelmed and Ethan said I was the only one who could keep things organized. That was my role in the family for years. Reliable. Useful. Easy to lean on. But usefulness is a dangerous foundation for love, because the minute people stop needing what you do, they start acting like your presence was optional all along. Ethan kept talking, saying everybody had been under a lot of pressure lately, that Dad had enough on his plate, that Mom was trying to hold everyone together, that I should really think about how I come across before assuming I was some kind of victim. Then, in the middle of all that, he said something that changed the entire shape of the night. He said, "This is exactly why the trust conversation should have happened without you there." He stopped speaking right after, the way people do when they realize they have let the wrong thing slip. I sat up so fast my knee hit the side of the nightstand. For a second neither of us said anything. Then I asked, "What trust conversation?" His answer came too quickly. "Nothing. Forget it." But he had already lost control of the call. My father had mentioned a family trust only a handful of times over the years, always vaguely, usually when he was talking about making sure everything was simple if anything ever happened to him. I had never been given details, but I knew enough to know it was not a casual word. Families like mine do not throw around terms like trust unless money, property, or control are involved. I kept my voice steady and asked again, "What conversation, Ethan?" He got defensive immediately. He said I was twisting things, that not everything was about me, that I needed to stop acting paranoid. Then he said the one sentence that told me more than he realized. He said, "Vanessa was right, you always make things harder when paperwork is involved." I did not respond right away because suddenly I was not hearing him anymore. I was hearing every odd silence from the past year. Every time I walked into a room and a conversation stopped. Every holiday where Vanessa watched me too carefully. Every moment my mother called me sensitive instead of answering a question. Paperwork. Not personality. Not old tension. Not emotional distance. Paperwork. Something had shifted behind the scenes, and whatever it was, they had wanted me excluded before it became official. Ethan must have sensed the silence changing because his tone softened in that fake, cautious way people use when they realize they may have said too much. He told me to get some sleep, that we could talk later in the week, that I should not ruin relationships over one misunderstood evening. I said good night and hung up before he could say anything else. Then I sat very still in the quiet of my bedroom and stared at the dark window across from me. My birthday dinner had not been a cruel impulse or some messy family misunderstanding. It had been strategy. And for the first time that night, the hurt began to make room for something colder, clearer, and much more dangerous than tears. The rest of that night I did not sleep so much as drift in and out of a kind of stunned awareness, my mind circling the same few words until they no longer sounded accidental. Trust conversation. Paperwork. Without you there. By 6 the next morning I was sitting at my kitchen counter in yesterday's sweatshirt with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm in my hands, staring at the pale strip of sunrise over the parking lot behind my building, and trying to decide whether I had finally become the paranoid daughter they all like to describe or whether I had simply been the last person to see what was happening. The strange thing about betrayal inside a family is that once one piece clicks into place, everything behind it starts rearranging itself. Moments you dismissed as awkward suddenly sharpen into evidence. Comments you let slide come back with edges. And by the time the sun was fully up, I was no longer asking myself whether Ethan had slipped. I was asking how long all of them had been moving around me like I was an obstacle instead of a daughter. I opened my laptop and started with the safest place I knew: old emails. At first I told myself I was only trying to calm down by focusing on something concrete, but that was not true. I was hunting. Not wildly, not emotionally, just methodically, the same way I used to untangle spreadsheets for my father when he got overwhelmed and started shoving bank envelopes into random drawers. My family had a long history of relying on me for the dull, responsible tasks nobody else wanted. Ethan handled charm. Molly handled disappearing when things got tense. My mother handled appearances. My father handled authority. I handled details. It was such an established pattern that for years I thought being needed meant being valued. I knew the passwords to old utility accounts, the filing system in the basement office at my parents' house, the name of the accountant my father trusted before he retired, the order in which my mother paid household bills, the insurance portal login they kept forgetting, the storage unit number for my grandmother's furniture after her condo was sold. When Dad had that minor heart scare 2 years earlier and Mom was too rattled to think clearly, I was the one who sat in the waiting room with a legal pad and wrote down every medication, every follow-up date, every phone number, every instruction from the cardiologist. Later that week, when my father was home recovering in his recliner and trying not to admit he was frightened, he asked me to come by and help him sort some personal documents because, in his words, "You are the only one who reads everything before signing it." I remember exactly where we were. In the den with the blinds half closed against the afternoon glare. The television muted. The smell of coffee and old leather in the room. He had a banker's box on the floor beside him and a folder on his lap, and he asked me to label a few things, scan 2 packets, and set aside what he called the trust file until he had time to review it with Mr. Howard Green. I had not read the contents then because it did not occur to me to violate his privacy, but I had handled the folder, scanned the cover pages, and saved backup copies where he asked me to save them. At the time, it felt like one more ordinary act of daughterly competence, the kind my family accepted without ceremony. Now it felt different. Now it felt like a reason. I searched my cloud drive first, then an old external hard drive I had not used in more than a year. There were folders full of tax PDFs, insurance forms, receipts, scanned notes from hospital visits, and the kind of household records people only appreciate when they suddenly need them. Around 9 in the morning I found a file labeled Dat Personal Archive 2024, and my pulse changed. I clicked it open and there they were, scanned cover sheets and signed summaries, and a note in my own handwriting from that afternoon in the den. Green to revise family trust after April review. It was not enough to tell me everything, but it was enough to confirm that Ethan had not invented the word in some random conversation. There had been a trust. There had been revisions. And somehow I, the person who once helped organize the files, had been repositioned as someone who needed to be kept away from the discussion. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen while the refrigerator hummed behind me, and a delivery truck beeped in reverse outside. Then another memory surfaced, small at the time, almost laughably small. Last fall, during Sunday dinner, I had reached for a stack of envelopes on the kitchen island because I thought one of them was mine. Vanessa had placed her hand flat over the pile and said with a smile, "Oh, those are just boring estate things, Claire, nothing you would want to get into tonight." My mother had laughed too quickly. My father had looked down at his plate. Ethan changed the subject. I remembered feeling a tiny flare of irritation, and then letting it go because I had trained myself for years to let things go if they threatened the family mood. That was the habit they counted on, more than my kindness, more than my loyalty. My willingness to smooth over the discomfort. To doubt myself first. To protect the group even when the group did not protect me. But sitting there in my apartment on the morning after my birthday, with a scan file open on my screen and last night's silence still hanging over everything, I understood something that would have sounded cruel if anyone else had said it. My family did not trust me less because I was unstable or dramatic or difficult. They trusted me less because I paid attention. And once that thought settled into place, the whole past year stopped looking like tension and started looking like preparation. By noon I had stopped pretending I was only looking for reassurance and admitted to myself that I was trying to map the architecture of a betrayal. There is something strangely clarifying about disappointment when it gets specific. The night before had been all feeling. All shock and humiliation and that hollow sinking disbelief that comes from seeing your own absence turned into somebody else's celebration. But now there were files, dates, half-finished revisions, remembered conversations, and the quiet certainty that none of this had been spontaneous. I made myself toast I did not eat, reheated the same coffee twice, and kept moving through old folders with a steadiness that surprised me. Every few minutes I would stop and stare out the kitchen window at the narrow strip of parking lot below, watching ordinary things happen: a woman loading groceries into the trunk of a silver SUV, a maintenance worker rolling a trash bin across the asphalt, a kid on a scooter cutting through the far corner by the dumpster, and it felt almost insulting that the world could look so normal when my entire understanding of my family had started to split open. Around 1 in the afternoon my mother called. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. Her voice had that careful softness she used whenever she wanted credit for being gentle while saying something unkind. She asked how I was doing, like we had not just gone through anything unusual. Then she said she hated misunderstandings and hoped I was not still upset about dinner. Not upset. As if I had simply been inconvenienced by a scheduling error instead of deliberately cut out of my own birthday, and then treated like I was too unstable to handle the truth. I said I was fine because I wanted to hear what she would say when she thought I was not pushing back. She told me everyone had been feeling a lot of strain lately, and that sometimes it was easier to keep gatherings small when emotions were running high. I asked her whose emotions she meant. She hesitated just long enough for me to hear the answer before she gave it. Vanessa has just been feeling some tension from you, she said. And with your father trying to sort through important family matters, I did not want anything to become uncomfortable. There it was again. Vanessa. Always present in the explanation, never positioned as the cause, always framed as the person who needed protecting. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, because once you know where to look, manipulation stops feeling mysterious and starts feeling repetitive. Vanessa never demanded things outright. She arranged emotional weather. She made herself the barometer for what was appropriate, what was too much, what was hurtful, what was stressful, what was gracious. If she seemed uncomfortable, the whole room adjusted. If she looked wounded, someone else became the aggressor. And because she delivered all of it with that polished little smile and her soft suburban voice, people mistook control for innocence. I asked my mother what exactly my father was sorting through. She answered too quickly, just paperwork, nothing dramatic, and then changed the subject by asking whether I still planned to come by next weekend for Molly's birthday brunch. I almost laughed. Less than 24 hours after excluding me from my own birthday, they were already testing whether I would keep showing up on command. I said I would let her know, and ended the call before she could wrap everything in one of her neat little bows. Afterward I sat in silence for a long minute, replaying the conversation, and what struck me most was not what she had said, but how practiced it felt. My mother had always been the family translator, the one who turned cruelty into misunderstanding, selfishness into stress, favoritism into practicality. She did not create every problem in our family, but she made almost all of them livable for the people causing them. And when I looked at the last few years through that lens, Vanessa's rise inside the family made a terrible kind of sense. She had understood the system almost immediately. She learned who needed flattering, who needed rescuing, who needed to feel wise, and who could be isolated by describing her as difficult. Ethan liked feeling chosen. My mother liked feeling needed. My father liked peace and would accept almost any version of events that preserved it. Molly liked staying out of conflict as long as the mood stayed pleasant. And me, I had spent most of my life doing the opposite of Vanessa. I thought being honest would matter more than being strategic. I thought consistency would speak for itself. I thought people remembered who had shown up for them when it counted. But families are not always fair in the way they distribute memory. By late afternoon I found myself thinking back to a dinner at my parents' house the previous spring, months before anything felt openly hostile. Dad had mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Howard Green was helping tighten up some long-term planning so that everything would be cleaner down the road. I had asked whether he meant the trust, and before my father could answer, Vanessa had smiled across the table and said, "Claire always perks up when paperwork and money come up," and Ethan had laughed like that was charming instead of insulting. My mother had told me not to be so serious. At the time I had brushed it off because pushing back would have made me look exactly the way Vanessa wanted me to look. Now, with the previous night still raw and the scanned files open in front of me, I could see what she had been doing. She had been laying emotional groundwork. Not to prove I was greedy because nobody who knew me would believe that, but to attach me to discomfort, suspicion, complication. To make any future objection sound like personality instead of fact. And the more I sat with that, the colder I became. Not louder. Not wilder. Just clearer. Vanessa had not stolen my place in the family overnight. She had replaced it one small adjustment at a time, until everyone else could pretend the new arrangement had always been natural. The only mistake they made was assuming I would stay the version of myself they had relied on for years, the daughter who noticed everything, understood more than they realized, and still chose to keep the peace. By the second morning after my birthday, something in me had settled into a new shape. The hurt was still there, sharp in unexpected places, but it was no longer the only thing I could feel. Underneath it was a steadiness I had not had before, the kind that comes when grief begins to organize itself into thought. I woke up before my alarm, made coffee, opened my laptop, and looked again at the scan files from my father's archive with the kind of focus I used to bring to exams in college, when I knew one wrong assumption could cost me the whole answer. I was not trying to prove that my family had stopped loving me. That was too vague to be useful. I was trying to understand what they needed from me, what they were hiding, and why excluding me had suddenly become so important. There were only a handful of documents in that old folder that pointed directly to anything formal, but one name kept appearing in notes and cover pages. Howard Green. I knew him, not personally exactly, but the way you know someone who has been orbiting your family for years. He was my father's attorney first, then later the man he trusted with what he called long-range housekeeping, which sounded harmless until you were old enough to understand it meant wills, trusts, property structure, contingency planning, all the quiet architecture behind a family's future. I had met him twice, maybe 3 times, always briefly, usually in passing at my parents' house. He was older, precise, and one of the few people my father never spoke over. I sat there with my mug warming my hands and tried to decide whether calling him would be reckless or necessary. Before I could talk myself out of it, my phone buzzed with a text from Molly. "Are you still upset?" No punctuation. No apology. Just that casual, careful distance she used whenever she wanted to acknowledge something without taking responsibility for it. Molly had always been the easiest one in the family to underestimate, mostly because she worked hard to seem harmless. She was younger than me by 3 years, pretty in that effortless way people complimented without realizing how much they were rewarding it, and she had spent most of her adult life mastering the art of remaining adjacent to conflict without ever stepping into it. She was not openly cruel the way Ethan could be when cornered, and she was not strategic the way Vanessa was. Molly specialized in survival. She went where the warmth was. She laughed with whoever was winning. She kept her hands technically clean and let silence do the rest. I looked at her message for a full minute before typing back. Not upset. Just paying attention. She did not respond. That told me more than anything she could have said. Around 10:30, I called Howard Green's office. I expected a receptionist, a voicemail tree, maybe an assistant who would tell me he was booked for the week. Instead, a calm older woman answered, took my name, paused for a moment, and then asked me to hold. 30 seconds later, Howard himself came on the line. His voice was measured and warm in a way that instantly made me more emotional than I wanted to be. He said, "Claire, it has been a while. How can I help you?" There are moments when life divides itself quietly, and looking back you realize the line was crossed in an ordinary sentence spoken in an ordinary tone. That was one of them. I told him I was not sure how much he could discuss, and that I was calling because something had happened with my family that made me think there had been recent movement around my father's trust or estate planning. I chose my words carefully. I did not accuse anyone. I did not sound frantic. I simply told the truth in the cleanest possible version. There had been a family gathering I was deliberately excluded from, conversations about paperwork I was not supposed to hear, and enough irregular behavior that I wanted to understand whether I had once been involved in any documented capacity beyond just being a daughter in the room. Howard was quiet long enough that I could hear the faint shuffling of paper on his end. Then he said something that sent a chill through me, not because it was dramatic but because it was not. He said, "Your father asked you to assist with organization during his medical scare, if I recall correctly." I said yes. He replied, "Then you may remember more than they assume." My fingers tightened around the mug. I asked whether there had been changes. He did not answer directly. Instead, he said there were limits to what he could disclose without formal authorization, but that I should know two general things. First, any trust structure with multiple interested parties is vulnerable to conflict when communication becomes selective. Second, if someone is being intentionally isolated before significant paperwork is presented, that is rarely accidental. I stared at the grain of my kitchen table while he said that, tracing a small water ring left by my coffee cup with my thumb, because hearing my private fear spoken back in neutral language made it feel suddenly real. I asked him very carefully whether I had ever been listed in any meaningful role. He said at one point, "Your father expressed confidence in your judgment with regard to documentation and review. That is all I can responsibly say right now." It was not a complete answer, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that my presence had once mattered in more than a sentimental way. Enough to suggest that whatever had shifted recently was not just about feelings around a dinner table. Howard then told me something I would turn over in my mind for days afterward. He said that in any family arrangement, the person who notices inconsistencies early often becomes inconvenient to the people benefiting from confusion. He did not say Vanessa's name. He did not say Ethan's. He did not need to. By the time I ended the call, the apartment around me felt strangely still, as if every object had taken one small step back to make room for the truth. My family had not simply stopped trusting me. They had started managing me. They needed me hurt, off balance, emotional enough to doubt myself and quiet enough to stay out of the room. And for the first time since that empty birthday table, I understood that my greatest advantage was no longer being the daughter who kept the peace. It was being the one person they had underestimated while moving pieces behind my back. After my call with Howard, I stopped reacting like a daughter waiting to be reassured and started thinking like someone who had finally understood the rules of the game, too late to be innocent, but not too late to protect herself. That shift did not feel dramatic on the outside. I did not slam drawers or pace my apartment or call anyone back demanding explanations. I rinsed out my coffee mug, wiped down the kitchen counter, and opened a fresh notes document on my laptop. Then I began listing every concrete thing I knew, every date I could confirm, every offhand comment that now sounded less like family friction and more like positioning. There is a strange kind of power in moving from pain to sequence. Once events start lining up, emotion stops being the only evidence. I wrote down the birthday dinner, Ethan's call, my mother's message about keeping things low stress, Vanessa's old comments about paperwork, my father's archived files, Howard's warning about selective communication. And then beneath all of it I wrote a single sentence that made my chest tighten the second I saw it on the screen. They need me unstable, not informed. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, the afternoon was bright and cold, the kind of late winter day where the sky looks almost metallic, and the sunlight coming through my kitchen window made everything in the apartment look sharper than usual. I could hear the hum of my refrigerator, the occasional dull thud of footsteps from the unit above me, the ordinary sounds of a weekday that suddenly felt miles away from the quiet war happening inside my own family. By 3 o'clock, I had made another decision, one that would have been impossible for the version of me who still believed honesty alone could fix things. I was not going to confront anyone yet. Not Ethan. Not my mother. Not Vanessa. People reveal the most when they think you are still standing exactly where they left you. If I pushed too early, they would tighten up, compare notes, smooth over contradictions, and recast everything as my latest emotional spiral. But if I stayed calm, if I gave them no visible resistance, they might keep moving forward under the assumption that I was hurt, confused, and still trying to earn my way back into the room. That, I realized, was their blind spot. They were used to a version of me that absorbed damage and then explained it away. They were not prepared for a version of me that could be silent on purpose. So I sent my mother a text that said, "I appreciate you checking in. I know things have been tense. Maybe we can all talk soon." I hated typing it. Every word felt like setting down a weapon I had only just realized I owned. But within minutes she answered with surprising warmth, as if I had passed some test. "I am glad you understand, sweetheart. We all want peace. Not love. Not honesty. Peace. The family's favorite disguise." About an hour later, Ethan texted too. He said he was glad I had calmed down, and that everybody had just been trying to avoid unnecessary drama, while Dad handled some important planning. That phrase, important planning, landed on me differently now. He thought he was being vague enough to stay safe. Instead, he confirmed exactly what I needed. There was planning. My father was involved. And Ethan believed the matter was far enough along that he could afford to be careless. I wrote back, I get it. Just let me know what I need to know when the time comes. I almost smiled after sending it, because I could picture how those words would be read in my family. Not as strategy, as surrender, as Claire finally learning not to make things difficult. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept working through old records. I pulled contribution receipts from when I had helped my parents cover part of the roof replacement on the lake house years ago, because Dad was juggling cash flow in one of his businesses. I found transfers I had made to Ethan during his rough patch before the wedding, messages from my mother thanking me for being the one person she could rely on, and scanned notes from my father with instructions written in his blocky handwriting. None of it gave me the full picture yet, but it did something almost as important. It reminded me who I had actually been in that family before Vanessa started rearranging the emotional furniture and calling the new layout normal. I had not been some unstable outsider hovering at the edge of serious matters. I had been the dependable one, the daughter trusted with details, the person who remembered, documented, followed up, and quietly held together the parts other people preferred to ignore. By early evening, I felt the first real edge of calm since my birthday. Not because I was less hurt, but because hurt was no longer the only thing guiding me. I made pasta, barely tasted it, then sat on my couch with a blanket over my legs and watched my phone without touching it. Right around 7:20, as if the family had coordinated another beat in whatever performance they thought they were managing, my mother sent a group message that included me for the first time in days. Sunday brunch at our place for Molly before her trip. Noon. Hope everyone can make it. Everyone. I stared at that word until it almost looked funny. After everything, after my empty birthday table and their polished excuses and Ethan's accidental confession, they were inviting me back in as though inclusion itself were a favor they could grant when convenient. My first instinct was anger. My second was clarity. This was not reconciliation. This was staging. Something was coming and they needed me present for it. Maybe a conversation. Maybe documents. Maybe a test to see how pliable I still was. Whatever it was, the invitation had arrived too neatly, too soon, and with too much confidence. I looked at the message thread, saw Molly's heart reaction, Ethan's thumbs up, Vanessa's cheerful count us in, and then I typed 3 words that changed everything. I will be there. Sunday arrived bright and deceptively gentle. The kind of early spring day that makes suburban streets look cleaner than they are. As if sunlight can bless anything it touches into innocence. I left my apartment a few minutes before 11:30 wearing a cream sweater, dark jeans, and the small gold hoops my grandmother gave me when I turned 21, not because I wanted to look impressive, but because I wanted to feel like myself walking into that house. The drive to my parents' place took 22 minutes if the lights cooperated, and along the way I passed the grocery store where my mother used to send me for last-minute pie crusts at Thanksgiving, the gas station where Ethan once called me crying because his debit card had been declined, and the church parking lot where Molly learned to drive in my father's old sedan while I sat in the back seat trying not to laugh every time she braked too hard. It struck me then that betrayal rarely happens in foreign places. It happens in the same neighborhoods where you once felt safe. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, I had already lowered the windows because I did not want to walk into that house carrying my own stale nerves with me. Their place looked exactly as it always had, white siding, blue shutters, neat box hedges trimmed too square because my father thought rounded edges looked careless, and the little brass wreath hook still hanging on the front door even though Christmas had been over for months. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off and watched through the front window as Vanessa crossed the dining room carrying a platter, smiling at something my mother said. She moved through that house like she had been born to it. Not in the loud way some women take over a family, but in that smoother, more effective way, where no single gesture is big enough to object to and yet somehow every room starts responding to her, as if she belongs there more than anyone else. I took a breath, picked up the lemon loaf I had bought for Molly because showing up empty-handed would have created its own conversation, and walked to the door. My mother opened it before I could knock twice. Her smile was warm but too prepared, the expression of a woman who had rehearsed her own innocence. She kissed the air near my cheek, took the loaf from my hands and said, "I am so glad you came," with the exact tone people use when they want credit for your forgiveness before they have earned it. Inside, the house smelled like coffee, baked cinnamon, and whatever floral hand soap my mother had recently decided the season required. Everything was in its place. The dining table was set with linen placemats. The fruit bowl was freshened. The little ceramic rabbit she only brought out in spring sat near the sink. It was also normal that for one dangerous second I almost wondered if I had imagined the severity of everything. Then Vanessa appeared from the kitchen holding a tray of mimosas and said, "Claire, I am so happy you made it," in that bright polished voice that always carried just enough sweetness to sound blameless. Ethan was behind her, already in weekend mode, sleeves rolled, smiling too casually. My father stood near the den with his coffee mug, looking older than he had a month earlier, not fragile exactly, but tired around the eyes in a way that made me feel a flicker of pity before I forced myself back into focus. Molly floated down the hallway in soft pink, hugged me with one arm, and thanked me for coming like I was the aunt who almost skipped a baby shower instead of her sister who had been shut out of her own birthday less than a week before. Everyone was kind. That was what made it eerie. Not loving. Not remorseful. Kind in the deliberate, managed way people behave when the real event has not happened yet, and they need the room to stay steady until it does. I could feel it under everything. Attention wrapped in hospitality. My mother offered coffee. Vanessa complimented my sweater. Ethan asked whether work had been busy. My father mentioned the weather. Molly laughed too brightly at something nobody said that was funny. I answered lightly, smiled when expected, and let them believe what they needed to believe, that I was still absorbable, still eager for scraps of inclusion, still unaware of the machinery behind the scene. But once you know a performance is happening, you stop getting distracted by the script and start studying the staging. The dining room sideboard was cleared more than usual, as if space had been made for paperwork or serving trays or both. My father's leather portfolio was on the console table by the den, not hidden, but not somewhere it would normally be left during a family brunch. Vanessa kept glancing toward it in tiny unconscious checks, the same way people keep looking at a gift they are excited to present. My mother's movements had that rigid efficiency she slipped into when nervous. Ethan watched me too closely each time I spoke, like he was waiting to see whether my mood matched the version of me they had spent the week discussing. I accepted a glass of orange juice instead of champagne because I wanted my head clear, then took a seat near the end of the table where I could see everyone at once. And as plates were passed, coffee was poured, and my family performed normalcy with almost professional commitment, I understood with complete certainty that Howard had been right. I was not there because they wanted peace. I was there because something important was about to be placed in front of me, and they believed the woman sitting at that table was still the daughter they could confuse before she had time to think. Brunch moved forward with the strained elegance of people trying to prove to themselves that nothing was fractured. My mother insisted everyone take more fruit. Ethan kept refilling coffee cups nobody had asked him to refill. Vanessa floated in and out of the kitchen with the confidence of someone who already knew how the scene was supposed to end. And all the while the conversation stayed carefully shallow: Molly's upcoming trip, a neighbor's new fence, the price of groceries, a restaurant opening downtown, the sort of harmless family chatter meant to create the illusion that the room was safe. Played my part. I smiled when appropriate. I asked Molly where she and her friends were staying. I complimented my mother on the cinnamon rolls even though I knew she had bought them from the bakery near the post office and just warmed them on her own tray. I let them believe I was settling back into place. That was the thing they never understood about me. They mistook self-control for softness. They thought because I had spent years keeping family peace, I did not know how to recognize strategy when I saw it. But by then I could feel the shape of the morning as clearly as weather before a storm. It was in the pauses that came too fast after certain topics. It was in the way my father kept glancing toward the den. It was in the way Vanessa watched my face every time the word future or planning came up, as if she were checking whether I had started connecting dots they hoped were still too far apart. At one point my mother stood to bring out a second pot of coffee and said, almost too casually, "Your father has been trying to get a few things organized these past couple of weeks. Nothing dramatic, just sensible paperwork." Nobody looked at me when she said it. That, more than the words themselves, told me I was supposed to hear it. I buttered half a biscuit, set the knife down neatly on my plate, and said, "That sounds smart. Dad has always been better when things are in order." My father nodded, grateful, I think, that I had not turned the sentence into a confrontation. But I saw Ethan shift in his chair. He was waiting for resistance. When it did not come, he relaxed just enough to become careless again. He said, "Yeah, we are just trying to make sure everything is streamlined, especially with the lake house and all that old documentation." The lake house. My pulse did not jump outward, but I felt it change inside me. That house had been one of the quiet fault lines in our family for years. Not because anyone openly fought over it, but because it sat at the intersection of memory, money, and entitlement, all the most dangerous things when mixed together. My parents bought it when I was in middle school. A modest place by Wisconsin standards, weathered cedar siding, 2 small docks, 1 screen porch, for bedrooms that always felt half a room too few once everyone married and multiplied. I had spent summers there sanding outdoor chairs, helping my father stain the deck, cleaning out kitchen cabinets after mice got in one winter, and writing checks when repairs came at the wrong time. Ethan treated it like a birthright. Molly treated it like a backdrop for photos. Vanessa treated it like a future asset. I took a slow sip of orange juice and said nothing. A few minutes later, Molly excused herself to take a call from a friend, and as soon as she left the table, the room changed. Not abruptly. Just enough. My mother folded her napkin and looked at my father. My father cleared his throat and set down his mug. Ethan leaned back. Vanessa stilled in that watchful, polished way of hers. It was almost impressive, how quickly they moved from family brunch into family business without ever acknowledging the transition. My father began with a little speech about getting older, wanting things simpler, not leaving confusion for the children down the road. He sounded sincere because he probably was sincere, at least in part. That was one of the harder truths about families like mine. The people doing harm are not always lying about everything. Sometimes they are just telling their version of necessity, and leaving you to disappear inside the gaps. He said Howard had been helping him review long-term planning, that a few documents needed signatures to keep things current, and that he wanted everyone aligned so there would be no misunderstandings later. Everyone aligned. There is no phrase more dangerous in a family than one that sounds cooperative while really meaning compliant. I looked at him and asked the simplest question I could. What kind of documents? My mother jumped in before he could answer. Nothing complicated, sweetheart. Just updates. That word landed on the table like a polished stone. Updates. As if paperwork somehow became morally neutral once you made it vague enough. Ethan added that they had been meaning to talk to me sooner. But things had been tense and nobody wanted to set me off. Set me off. There it was again, the little narrative they had been building around me. Not a daughter with a right to clarity, but a potential disturbance to be managed. I let that pass too. Across the table, Vanessa offered me a sympathetic little smile and said, "We all just thought it would go better if we did this in person, when everyone was calm." I met her eyes then, really met them, and for the first time since I arrived, I let her see that I understood exactly what she was doing. Her smile held, but only just. My father stood, walked to the console table near the den, and picked up the leather portfolio I had noticed earlier. When he came back, he did not hand it to my mother or Ethan. He placed it directly in front of me. My family went quiet in that total, deliberate way people do when they have all agreed the next few seconds matter. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the folder, and felt the whole week gather itself into one point. They had not invited me for coffee and cinnamon rolls. They had invited me to sign something. For a moment nobody moved. The portfolio sat in front of me on the linen placemat like it belonged there, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. A daughter being handed family paperwork between coffee and cinnamon rolls after being deliberately excluded from her own birthday days earlier. My father kept one hand resting lightly on the leather cover, not quite letting go, and I could see in the set of his shoulders that he wanted this to feel dignified. My mother folded her hands in her lap, and gave me that small encouraging smile she used whenever she wanted obedience to look like harmony. Ethan leaned back in his chair with the forced casualness of a man pretending not to care about an outcome he had already built plans around. Vanessa sat perfectly still, mouth softened into concern, eyes alert in that quiet predatory way I had come to recognize. I looked down at the portfolio and then up at my father. "What exactly am I signing, Dad?" He cleared his throat and said it was not a big deal, just an acknowledgement so future asset distribution would be cleaner, less messy, more streamlined if anything ever happened. He used 3 different versions of the same idea without actually naming the thing itself, which told me immediately that clarity was the one thing nobody at that table wanted. I opened the portfolio slowly. On top was a cover letter from Howard Green's office. Beneath it were summary pages, signature tabs, and a stapled packet with language dense enough to blur if you let anyone rush you. I did not let anyone rush me. I read the first page, then the second, then the third, aware of every breath at the table. The packet described a revised family trust structure, updated authority language regarding the lake house, and a reallocation mechanism that would, in plain English, narrow my future interest while consolidating decision-making power elsewhere, mostly through my father in the present and then through Ethan under certain conditions. It was written carefully, professionally, even elegantly, but the meaning underneath it was brutal. My role was being reduced from someone with standing to someone expected to step aside gracefully. My mother spoke first because she could never tolerate silence unless she controlled it. She said, "We just want things simple, sweetheart." Ethan added that this would avoid confusion later, especially because he and Vanessa were more settled and more prepared to handle long-term responsibility. More settled. I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the man I had loaned money to, covered for, organized for, defended to our father more times than he would ever admit, and I almost admired the confidence it took to recast dependence as leadership while I sat 3 feet away. Vanessa finally entered the conversation in that low, soothing tone of hers. She said nobody was trying to hurt me, that this was only about practicality, and that sometimes the person who lived closest and had the most stable household was simply the logical choice. There are insults that only work if everyone agrees to pretend they are not insults. That sentence was one of them. The stable household. As if I were some drifting emotional figure instead of a 30-year-old woman with a steady job, her own apartment, no debt except a manageable car payment, and years of documented responsibility in the very family business they were now trying to rewrite around me. I kept reading. There was language about voluntary acknowledgement, language about informed consent, language about waiving future dispute relating to specified allocations once reviewed and signed. And there, nestled inside the packet with all the politeness of professional formatting, was the thing they needed most from me. My signature would not just accept less. It would help legitimize how the change happened. It would turn exclusion into agreement. My father said, almost pleading now, "I do not want this to become bigger than it needs to be." I asked him when he had decided to do this. He answered with the truth trimmed down to something survivable. He said they had been discussing updates for a while. Ethan jumped in and said Howard had recommended getting things in order before summer. My mother said everyone had families to think about now. Vanessa said nothing, but I could feel her attention sharpen when my fingers paused over one specific paragraph. That paragraph referenced all interested parties receiving fair opportunity for review absent coercion, misrepresentation, or undue pressure. I read it twice, then a third time. The room around me seemed to pull back slightly, as if everything else had gone quieter to make space for that one line. My father mistook my stillness for hesitation he could manage. He said I did not need to worry, that Howard had looked everything over. Ethan told me not to read too much into formal wording. My mother reached across the table and touched my wrist with 2 fingers, the exact gesture she had used when I was a child, and she wanted me to stop asking questions in public. She said, "Claire, please do not make this ugly." That was the moment the whole thing became crystal clear. Not because of the documents themselves, though they mattered. Not because of Ethan's ambition, or Vanessa's manipulation, or my father's cowardly preference for easy peace over honest conflict. It became clear because of that word. Ugly. They were not afraid of unfairness. They were afraid of interruption. They did not fear doing something wrong nearly as much as they feared me naming it while it was still happening. I closed the packet gently, aligned the edges, and placed both hands on top of it. Nobody spoke. Even Molly, who had returned at some point and was now frozen halfway between confusion and avoidance, did not dare break the silence. I looked first at my father, then at my mother, then Ethan, then Vanessa. I let each of them feel seen in the exact role they were playing. And then, in the calmest voice I had used all week, I said, "Before I sign anything, I think all of you need to understand something very clearly. I already know more about this trust than you think I do." The silence after I said it was so complete I could hear the little ticking sound of my mother's kitchen clock from the wall near the pantry. It had always been there, white enamel with black hands, The kind of clock nobody notices until a room gets tense enough for small mechanical things to sound loud. My father straightened slightly in his chair. My mother withdrew her hand from my wrist as if she had touched something hot. Ethan gave a short laugh that did not sound amused, just defensive, and said, "Claire, come on, do not do this." Vanessa did not move at all, but something in her face tightened around the eyes. She was the only one at that table who understood right away that I was no longer improvising from hurt. I was speaking from information. I kept my hands resting lightly on the closed packet and said, "Dad asked me to help organize personal files after his heart scare." I scanned backup documents. I logged notes. I remember more than you assumed I would, and I know enough to recognize exactly what this is asking me to waive. My father looked stunned in that quiet, old-fashioned way men sometimes do when they realize competence they once praised in private has now become inconvenient in public. He said my name once softly, not angry yet, just caught off guard. My mother recovered first because she always did. She said nobody was trying to hide anything, and that if there had been misunderstandings, this was precisely why we were all sitting down together as a family. Together. That word almost would have been funny if the whole thing had not been so insulting. I looked at her and said, "You had dinner without me on my birthday and posted family only. Let us not pretend togetherness is the principle guiding this process." Molly's face changed at that. She looked down at her plate immediately, and in that one quick movement I learned something important. She might not have designed any of this, but she knew enough to feel ashamed when it was named out loud. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table, and tried to take control the way he always did when a room started slipping from him. He said everybody had made mistakes, that I was personalizing something administrative, that the trust language was standard and I was reading it like an attack because I wanted a reason to be offended. I let him finish because people reveal more when they think volume counts as authority. Then I reopened the packet, turned it toward him, and placed one finger on the paragraph I had marked in my head. I read it aloud in a calm, even tone, the part about informed review and the absence of coercion, misrepresentation, or undue pressure affecting any acknowledgement by an interested party. Then I looked at my father and said, if I was excluded from family communication, framed as emotionally unstable, and invited here under false pretenses to sign a document that reduces my standing while everyone pressures me to keep things calm, that is not a clean process. That is a compromised one. No one spoke. Even Ethan did not try, not for a few seconds. My father's face lost color first. My mother's mouth parted slightly. Vanessa, for the first time since I had known her, stopped performing softness. It was subtle, just the disappearance of that polished expression she wore like a shield, but it was enough. Underneath it, there was calculation and something very close to fear. She said carefully, "Claire, I think you are making assumptions that are going to damage relationships for no reason." I turned to her and said, "No, Vanessa, I think you have spent the last year making it easier for everyone to believe I was the problem so they would not have to look too hard at the timing of these changes. You did not need to shout. You only needed to manage the mood." My mother immediately said that was unfair. Ethan told me to leave his wife out of it. My father rubbed a hand over his forehead like the pressure in the room had finally reached him. But I did not stop, because for once I was not there to preserve their comfort. I reached into my tote bag, the one I had brought with me that morning because I had promised myself I would not arrive unprepared, and I took out a slim folder of my own. Not dramatic. Not thick. Just enough. Printed copies of archived email references, contribution records tied to property maintenance, notes in my father's handwriting about document review, and a summary I had typed for myself with dates attached to every suspicious shift in communication. I set it on the table with a care that made the gesture more powerful than anger ever could have. My father looked at the top page and went very still. Ethan stared at me as though he had forgotten who I was. My mother whispered, "Claire." And then I said the sentence that changed the room completely. "I have already spoken to Howard Green." That landed harder than anything else, harder than the trust language, harder than the printed papers, harder even than the birthday exclusion. Because Howard was not family emotion. Howard was structure. He was procedure. He was the outside world where careful wording had consequences. Ethan pushed his chair back a few inches and said, "You went behind our backs." I almost laughed then because there are accusations so absurd they collapse under their own weight. I said, "After being cut out of decisions, cut out of communication, and then handed a document." To sign without honest context, yes, I made sure I understood what I was looking at. My father finally spoke, and his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. He asked what Howard had said. I answered honestly but selectively. I said he reminded me that any process involving selective communication and emotional pressure creates serious concerns, and that no reasonable person would sign a waiver or acknowledgement under those circumstances without independent review. I did not tell them everything. I did not need to. The truth had already done what I needed it to do. It had broken the illusion that I was confused, isolated, and easy to move around. My mother looked close to tears, not because she thought I was right, but because the scene had become exactly what she feared most, public enough within the family to be undeniable. Ethan was angry now in that hot, resentful way people get when manipulation stops working. Vanessa stayed silent, which told me more than any protest would have. And my father, the man who had always preferred a tidy house over an honest argument, sat at the head of the table staring at papers he suddenly understood could not be pushed through over brunch. I closed my folder, slid the trust packet back across the placemat toward him and said, I am not signing anything today. In fact, until this process is reviewed properly, with full disclosure and without pressure, nothing about this is settled. After I said it, nobody tried to stop me when I stood up. That was the part one remembered most later, not the shock on Ethan's face or the pale silence that settled over my mother, but the fact that for once no one rushed in to correct my tone, reshape my meaning, or tell me what kind of daughter I was supposed to be. I slid my folder back into my tote, left the unsigned packet on the table, and picked up my coat from the back of the chair with hands that were steadier than I felt. My father said my name one more time, low and tired, but there was no authority left in it now, only the strained uncertainty of a man realizing the arrangement he had hoped would pass quietly had already failed. I looked at him and said the only thing that mattered anymore. Phew. Wanted fairness, you should have started with honesty. Then I walked out through the same front door I had entered less than 2 hours earlier carrying a lemon loaf, and pretending I did not know I was being staged into a family performance. Outside, the air was cool and bright, and the sunlight hit the windshield of my car so hard I had to shade my eyes for a second before unlocking the door. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, both hands resting on it, and let the quiet settle through me. I expected to shake. I expected to cry. I expected some dramatic collapse now that the confrontation was over. But what came instead was something I had not felt in years around my family. Relief. Not because I had won anything yet. Not because the paperwork vanished or the damage was undone, but because the worst thing had finally happened. They had shown me exactly how far they were willing to go, and I had answered as myself, not as the easier version of me they had trained themselves to expect. By the time I got home I had 2 voicemails from my mother, one from Ethan, and a text from Molly that said I did not know it was going to happen like that. I listened to none of the voicemails right away. I read Molly's message twice and then set the phone down without replying. There are moments when immediate forgiveness is just another way of helping other people avoid the full shape of what they have done. Instead, I took off my shoes, changed into sweatpants and opened my refrigerator. The birthday cake was still there on the top shelf, untouched, perfect in a way that almost hurt. Happy 30th, Claire. Still written in soft gold frosting. Like a message delivered to the wrong life. I stood there looking at it for a long moment, then lifted it out carefully and set it on the counter. I cut myself one slice, small at first, the way you do when you are not sure whether you can actually eat after an emotional week, and carried it to the table that had been set for 6 that night and had held only me. The tulips were gone by then, their heads beginning to bow in the vase, but the table itself looked strangely peaceful. I sat down in the same chair, took a bite of cake that tasted sweeter than I expected, and realized the week had closed a circle I had not chosen but desperately needed. On my birthday, they had decided I was not family when family was convenient, decorative, or profitable. At brunch, they learned I was not disposable when family became legal, financial, and documented. Over the next few days, things unfolded exactly the way people like Vanessa always fear once silence breaks. Howard Green requested that no revised trust acknowledgments proceed without formal independent review and clear disclosure. My father, faced with the possibility of a challenged process and written scrutiny, he could not smooth over with household language, backed away from finalizing anything. Ethan sent 3 increasingly angry messages about betrayal and disrespect, all of which conveniently ignored the small matter of my own exclusion, and the paper they tried to slide under it. My mother cried, then explained, then cried again, which in our family had always been a way of making pain visible without quite making accountability visible with it. Molly eventually called and admitted she had known something was coming, though she insisted she had not understood the details. I believed that, mostly. Vanessa never contacted me directly. That told me everything. A woman who has spent years managing the emotional climate of a family only goes quiet when the room no longer belongs to her. The trust was not dissolved. The lake house did not vanish. Nobody was ruined. That was never the point. I did not need to destroy my family to stop them from writing me out of it on their terms. I only needed to remove the one thing they had counted on most, my willingness to stay confused while they called it peace. It has been months now and things are still different. Smaller, quieter, less decorated with illusion. I see my father sometimes for coffee in public places where conversations have to stay honest because there is no kitchen performance to hide behind. My mother and I speak carefully. Ethan and I barely speak at all. Molly tries. Vanessa remains a closed door, and I no longer knock. The lake house is still under review. The paperwork is slower now, stricter, watched more closely. The family fortune they tried to funnel neatly around me did not disappear, but their access to it stopped being easy, automatic, and unquestioned the moment I refused to sign away my place in silence. And sometimes, usually late at night when my apartment is quiet and the city outside has gone soft around the edges, I think back to that birthday table, the candles, the untouched plates, the post that said family only. I used to think that was the night they took something from me, but I see it differently now. That was the night they handed me the truth. They showed me exactly who could smile while excluding me, who could call control peace, who could mistake my patience for weakness, and who would only value my place in the family when I stopped letting them define it for me. Turning 30 did not give me the celebration I thought I was waiting for. It gave me something harder and far more useful. It gave me the end of confusion. And once that happened, I did not need their table to have a place. I already had my own.